He is relatively newly minted Georgetown Professor Steve Vladeck. Steve, what's your like official? Are you like the William H. Macy Chair Emeritus? What's your official title?
I think it's the Agnes Williams Sesquicentennial Professor of Federal Courts, which, I think the real challenge of my job is spelling sesquicentennial.
Sesquicentennial. It's always funny when I like try to list like a professor's like job because they're all like these endowed chairs. Anyway, Steve Vladeck writes one first, which many of you already subscribe to, and if you don't, I would urge you to. And trust me, after this conversation, if you don't, you will. So, Steve, I got a bunch of. I mean, I've been wanting to do this for a while because, much to my mother's chagrin, I did not become a lawyer, and I feel like politics always ends in the law, but more so this administration than any other. I want to read you something that I was so glad that you and I had scheduled to talk because I read this in Political Playbook this morning, and I just want you to react to that, and we'll get into a bigger thing. This is what they said on Monday alone. So yesterday on Monday alone, five different judges around the U.S. issued temporary blocks on five different Trump ordered executive actions. I mean, that is stunning. In one day, can you? I want to get to the bigger picture and then go down in the weeds a little bit. I've heard people say, it's happened a lot in the last 48 hours, constitutional crisis or a constitutional crisis is looming. Is that in your mind, in your expertise, overblown, underblown, if that's a thing, properly blown? Like what's your kind of like take on that? Is it too alarmist or not alarmist enough?
I actually think it's just distracting. I mean, like,
Okay.
I could make the case for and against Chris. It doesn't matter because the reality is the same, which is, we have a president who is claiming as much, unilateral power over spending, power over the bureaucracy, right? Power over, you name it, really, that we've ever seen before. I mean, everyone has their favorite examples of a president who they think acted badly. But you could add up, I think, Chris, most of the examples that people usually trot out, and you'd still have more over the last 3 weeks, right? The sort of trying to claim all of Congress's spending power, but, trying to
Absolutely.
sort of, totally take over the entire bureaucracy, including the civil service. Redoing how the Treasury Department pays everybody. I mean, these are all just sort of striking attempts to accumulate power in the White House. And, we can talk about how many of them are illegal. But whatever term you put on it, Chris, I mean, call it a constitutional crisis, call it a political crisis, call it a bagel, right? It's still,
Right.
the reality is that it is a president who is attempting to consolidate power at the expense of every other institution of government.
And can you give me some historical perspective, Steve? Because I do think one of the things that I think we all struggle with, particularly people who spend a lot of time in the political media, is we stand this close to the picture, right? We're right on top of it, and everything is the biggest or the most egregious or the best. You know what I mean? It's like I think it's part of kind of internet culture. It's like the only thing
And
people want
sports
to click
culture,
on.
right? The
Yes,
GOAT.
it's it. It is. It totally is. It's like the only thing people will click on is the best thing or the worst thing. So, how anomalous is this? Because what I know, and this is not from a legal perspective, but what I know about the presidency and the executive branch is certainly since, I mean, definitely since George W. Bush. I'm just trying to go back to the memory banks, but certainly since George W. Bush, there has been an effort by the executive, Democrat or Republican, to expand the power of the executive.
Sure.
It certainly sort of it makes sense, right? They want to have as much power as possible. So, how anomalous? Given number one, you agree with that, and number two, how is this then different in kind
Yeah.
from what we've seen?
So my answer to both questions, Chris, is yes.
Okay,
And so, every modern president except Jimmy Carter was actively invested in expanding the powers of the executive branch while they were president. And so
yeah,
that's been true. You know, Jimmy Carter's an exception. If it's an interesting question about how that happened and why, but Democrats and Republicans alike, really going back to FDR,
yes,
have
yep,
all done critically important things to expand executive power.
I'm taking
Um,
notes, by the way. I'm not just staring lonely off camera.
you
Yeah.
know, my wife doesn't listen at all when I talk, so it's um,
I didn't say I was taking notes on what you said. I just said I
yeah,
was taking notes. Yeah, no, go
fair
ahead.
enough. Um, I still think that what we're seeing these last 3 weeks is different in kind and not just degree, and it's
Okay.
different in kind, Chris, even from the first Trump administration, um, where I think folks might remember just how chaotic those first couple of weeks were with the travel ban
Yep.
and with other aggressive maneuvers that Trump tried to pull off. What I find striking about this moment compared to that one is two big structural differences. The first is Trump is claiming Congress's power in ways that he really only did once or twice during the first administration. And he's claiming it across the board. I mean, every day, twice a day, 3 times a day.
Yep.
And some of that's, with the assistance of Elon Musk. Some of that actually is not directly related to Musk. But there's an arrogation of congressional power, the likes of which we have not seen on the scale before. And I think, Chris, the second part of it is even during Trump's first term, when at least for the first 2 years he had a Republican trifecta,
Hmm.
right? He still had Republicans in Congress who wouldn't let him do whatever he wanted to do. I mean, he had, John McCain in the Senate. There were
Yep.
moderate Republicans in the House, and now we're just seeing over and over again Congress willfully surrendering its constitutional prerogative. And what that means and what that sets up is it sets up a collision course between Trump and the courts. Because if
Right.
Congress is not going to do anything on the institutional front, we're left to the president and the courts with no one in between. It's why we're seeing all this litigation.
So I want to get to that. I want to pick at one string that you mentioned because I think so many people focus on what Trump is doing and expansion of executive power, but exactly what you said, I think all the time. It takes two to tango, right? Congress is constitutionally a co-equal branch. So it all. I mean, I learned that in American civics. It, only by Congress ceding its co-equality, if that's a word, you know what I mean, are we getting eventual face-off between the other two branches, right? I mean, it really is that piece. I think is underappreciated. The level to which Congress is like, I mean, I was. This is not a legal matter, but I was stunned when Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, replaced the Intel Committee chair
Yep.
at the behest of Donald Trump. You would have never forget that they're in the same party. A Speaker of the House would never deign to take orders from a president. I know that might seem crazy to some people, but look, when you're the Speaker of the House, you are the head of a co-equal branch of government, or one of the heads. And now it's just like whatever you say, sir. And can you talk about that? And then I want to get into like what you
Yeah.
laid out about legal versus executive, or judicial versus
Yeah.
executive branch. But can you talk about the congressional piece of it?
I mean, so you mentioned Speaker Johnson. I think he was one upped by Tom Cole, who's a Oklahoma congressman, who's the
Yep.
chair of the House Appropriations Committee, who said, and Chris, I could not like when I first saw this quote, I emailed the reporter who got it to make sure that he had gotten it correctly,
Totally.
right? And the quote was something to the effect of, "The thing you have to understand is appropriations are not laws." Um, and my reaction to that is, Chris. I mean, not only are appropriations
Of
laws,
course they are.
um, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 of the Constitution says appropriations have to be laws. I mean, it's the only thing the Constitution says Congress alone must do. And it's not like Tom Cole is a random member of the body. He's the chair of the Appropriations Committee.
And nor I'll add is Tom Cole some like deep magnified. I mean, Tom Cole, for people who don't know, Tom Cole was a political pollster and consultant for decades. I mean, that's how I knew Tom
Yeah.
Cole. He eventually ran for office, but he had done J.C. Watson's race and that sort of thing. Tom Cole is, well, I don't know if this exists anymore, but is the Republican establishment. I mean, Tom Cole is no more a Donald Trump person than Mitch McConnell is a Trump person.
But that's the point. They're all
Yeah,
Donald Trump people now, right?
that's right.
And
That you're
and
right. Yep.
I mean, you're exactly right that it's telling that it's Tom Cole, just like it's telling about the Republican senators, right, who are not standing up to any of Trump's nominees for positions that they have absolutely no business holding, right? So the problem is that I see sort of two very different problems with Congress just surrendering all of its prerogatives, right? The first is it just totally takes off the table right? The actual most representative part of our democracy. So now, instead of us speaking through our representatives in Congress, right? Now it's just, oh, well, 77 million people voted for Trump, therefore all of us in Congress can only do what Trump wants. Like
Yep.
that's never been how we've understood the structure of
No.
our government.
Nope.
And then
That's
second,
why we have an executive and a legislative branch.
well, and it's why the legislature's first. I mean, I know math is hard, but like Article One of the Constitution isn't about the executive. The draft of the Constitution started with Congress for a reason. And the second part is the result is, Trump got sued all the time during the first administration, but when you had a functioning Congress that still had a leveraging effect on a lot of what he wanted to try to do,
Yes.
right? He wasn't able to get through the ACA repeal because of McCain, right? Stuff like that. Um, with a completely compliant Congress, it just puts so much pressure on the courts, who in turn, Republicans in Congress are now starting to attack, right? With
Well, I mean, JD Vance.
right, Vance. I mean, so Vance is tricky. I actually think Vance. There's more nuance to what Vance said than to what a lot of other members have said. Right,
Explain.
and so what Vance what some other members are saying, right? So there's a resolution to impeach the judge in New York who issued the TRO. Like that's just nonsense, right? There's, Mike Johnson says the courts are pushing back too aggressively against Trump. That's nonsense. What Vance said was an important step more nuanced. And I wrote about this in my newsletter last night. Vance
For
said,
people who just
yeah.
joined, let me quickly make the plug.
Oh, sorry.
Steve writes one first on Substack. Over 50,000 subscribers already. But if you didn't think being a constitutional and legal expert mattered before the start of this administration, 3 weeks into this administration, I think by now it's been proven it does. So if you don't subscribe to Steve, go ahead. But Steve, go ahead. Explain JD Vance, because I'm fascinated by it, because I don't understand the nuance.
Yeah, so Vance sent out this tweet over the weekend that I think was probably somewhat deliberately designed to be misconstrued. But what he said was, I want to get this exactly right because I think the language matters. So he said, judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. And Chris, what is striking about that line is that it is begging the entire question, which is what makes the president's power legitimate.
Yep. Yep.
And so, Vance is absolutely right if you interpret what he's saying as once the president's acting within the discretion committed to him by law, the judges have no right to tell him how to exercise that discretion, right? We can't say buy this many airplanes, right? Or build the ship this way, right? Like that's right. And Chris, it's not new and it's not controversial. What Vance is not sort of getting into is who decides whether the executive action is legitimate, right? Who decides whether the power is legitimate? And historically, of course, that's been the role of the courts. And so, I think a lot of folks assume that Vance was saying the courts can't do any of what they're doing.
Right.
No, I think what he's saying is the question is whether what we, the White House, the executive branch are doing is legitimate or not. But that's just, I find that, Chris, a very, very convenient sleight of hand by the vice president who should have known better, but not quite the crossing of the Rubicon that I think a lot of us interpreted it to be.
Okay. I actually think that's really useful because I do think there is an element of assuming everything that they're doing is the worst thing that's ever been done and lacks nuance. And I kind of like to be like, not exactly. All right. So, Steve, again, looking from the non-lawyer, non-constitutional expert perspective, it seems to me like there is a concerted effort ongoing here to set up exactly what before we talked about the legislative branch, to exactly what you were saying, to set up a sort of game of chicken is the right word, but a series of legal confrontations over what a president can, and I guess conversely cannot do. It seems as though that is a clear strategy that is going here, is to sort of test the outer limits. In the same way, I would argue that nominating Matt Gaetz for Attorney General is like, well, let's see what we can do here. Are they willing? Like, where is the line, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, Matt Gaetz for AG was the line. But Tulsi Gabbard for Director of National Intelligence is not the line. RFK Jr. for HHS is not the line. Is that what's happening legally? Is that like are they sort of testing the outer rim of the legal system?
I don't think there's any question,
Okay.
and I think, but so Chris, note how that changes the focus though a bit of what Vance is saying. So it's not that they're setting up to ignore the courts; it's that they're trying to pressure the courts. Um, and so
Yeah.
right,
And do
pressure
you
the
think that's what's going on?
yes, 100%.
Not
Um,
ignore, but pressure. Bring political pressure to bear on them.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I mean, look back at if we just look back at the first Trump administration, which I think in retrospect is going to look like the JV, maybe even the freshman team version of what we're seeing here. Um, look at the travel ban, right? I mean, so the first version of the travel ban was this chaotic, massively overbroad, poorly executed, airport craziness inducing phenomenon
Yeah.
that was quickly blocked by the courts and that the Trump administration didn't even really appeal. Um, then they went back to the drawing board and tried the second iteration of the travel ban,
Yep.
right? And it was a little more nuanced and it was a little more sort of careful and it sort of left out the most obvious problems. And that was blocked by the courts.
Yep.
So they went back to the drawing board and they did the third version. And that was ultimately upheld by the Supreme Court, right? Even though, Chris, if they had started with the third version on day one, I don't
It
know that the Supreme Court would have upheld it.
it's so just very quickly, one of the things it's so interesting you say that because one of the things I think, and I think Trump does this politically and now legally, I always compare it to a basketball game. If you start the basketball game and you tell your team, look, we're going to try and steal the ball. We're going to press them. We're going to try and steal the ball on every single play. You can foul the shit out of them. Make them call it. Make the refs call it. The refs are then forced into one of two options. One, call all the fouls that they would if that wasn't your strategy and foul your whole team out in the first quarter, or adjust, do that, and thereby let things that are by legal definition a foul call the foul, right? And that sounds like what they're sort of doing. It's exactly if the third version was the first version of the travel ban, it wouldn't have passed Supreme Court muster. But because they had gone so far out, and then they had gone a little less far and a little less far, it winds up working.
I think that's right. And so, I know that folks are inclined to believe the worst of everything this administration is doing. And frankly, they've done nothing to dispel that reaction. Um, but I do think that insofar as this is a concerted strategy and not just a series of, sort of flashpoints and whack-a-mole, I think the notion is not to set up like a constitutional confrontation with the courts so much as it is to put so much pressure on the courts that the courts can't possibly push back against everything. Um, and the result will be that, sort of 2 years from now or 18 months from now, a lot of the stuff will have been struck down, but Chris, not all of it. And in the meantime, we have both chaos as you have the necessary sort of trying to figure out like what the rules are on a day-to-day basis when you have such fast-moving litigation. And then Trump also gets to have, a boogeyman, which is, oh, look at the reason why I wasn't able to do all the things I promised was John Roberts.
Yep.
Um,
Yep. He
right. And
failed
so
us.
that's right. And I just think that like that is not quite as dangerous as Trump saying John Roberts has made his ruling. Now let's see him try to enforce it. But in the long term, this is why Congress's surrender and departure is so important because you know the courts can defend themselves briefly, and we're seeing that this week. The courts can defend themselves in individual cases, but for this kind of systemic push, you really need more than just the executive branch versus the judiciary.
Yes. Can I? This is a little bit of a side question, but one I'm super interested in. How much? I mean, look, Donald Trump has a big team of lawyers and and legal strategists. How much of this of what they're doing is defensible from a legal perspective and just a matter of well we interpret either the law or the precedent differently than maybe the mainstream, and how much of
Yeah,
this is just like what the hell, like I'm trying to, you know what I mean, because it's like
yeah,
these are the first term, at least the early part of the first term, when I think many of the people who work for him were just blatantly incompetent. It strikes me that many of these people, at least on the political side, are not incompetent, and so that's where like where is this coming from? Is there, and I know we're talking about a number of fronts that they're moving on legally, but broadly, can you speak to that?
Sure. I mean, so I think part of why it's tricky to generalize here is because some of the flashpoints that we've seen don't seem to have been part of the grand strategy, right? So, for example, the OMB spending freeze, which I think was the first like massive, massive shock to the system, by all accounts was not cleared with the White House, and it was just Mark Paoletta on a frolic, um, right? So, I guess the tricky part here is that I think some of what they're doing can be rationalized either with existing law or with reasonable arguments about where this Supreme Court is going. So, for example, I mean, I think firing inspectors general is a really dumb thing to do, especially when you're complaining about fraud and waste and abuse, which is their job. Um,
Right, right,
right. But I also think that this particular Supreme Court might actually be willing to agree that the president gets to fire inspectors general. Right? Versus what's happening with money. I mean, the appropriation stuff, the refusing to spend money Congress has appropriated. Chris, that's never been on the wall, and just a couple of examples of that. So, when we think of what folks call the unitary executive theory of executive power, this is the idea that the Constitution makes the president the sole boss of the executive branch, so he must have complete bureaucratic control.
hmm
Um, when I think of Supreme Court justices who are adherents of that theory, I think of John Roberts, I think of William Rehnquist. Um, Rehnquist rejected this theory when he was in the Justice Department in 1969. John Roberts rejected this theory when he was in the Reagan White House in 1985. The Office of Legal Counsel, which is not usually shy about claiming executive power on behalf of the president,
right, right.
rejected this theory in 1988. So, I think that the spending stuff is totally off the wall. Right? I think the birthright citizenship stuff is totally off the wall.
Right, it's just
Um,
blatantly anti-constitutional, right? I mean,
yes,
like,
and not just and Chris, everyone's jumping to the Constitution. Congress also passed a statute in 1940 that creates birthright citizenship on the terms the Supreme. So, before we even get to trying to
yeah,
rewrite the 14th Amendment, you
yeah,
have a statutory problem,
yeah,
right? Versus the sort of, and then with regard to the bureaucratic stuff, I would separate out Trump going after senior people in agencies, which I think he gets to do under the Supreme Court's precedents. Trump going after mid-level people, which is a closer call under the court's precedents, and then Trump trying to decimate the civil service, right, which would require the Supreme Court to go even further than it suggested it wants to in how far it's going to embrace the unitary executive. So that to me is the gradations.
and just this is sort of a piggyback, and it may be the same answer, but when you look at these things, Steve, are is your view sort of like, okay, well, birthright citizenship that won't go anywhere? Like, are there things that have been proposed or that he signed executive orders to where you think, okay, like, yes, it will be litigated, but like there's a 99.9% chance that it will end this way. It will be an adverse ruling him versus things where you're like, that's like more of a 50-50 case.
Yes. So birthright citizenship goes in the category of he's going to lose that case. Right. I think at least some of the spending stuff, if it gets to the court on the merits, Chris, as opposed to on some technical procedural question, he loses.
And the
But
merits being who ultimately is in charge of
right,
the
right. Can
budget of the
can the
federal
president
government.
can right? Does the president have the constitutional authority to refuse to spend money Congress has appropriated? Um, I think the executive branch restructuring stuff is where I'm not nearly as sanguine about the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court has been so invested, Chris, more than any Supreme Court in American history, um, in growing the president's ability to control the bureaucracy. And so, when it comes to, for example, I mean, Hamp Dellinger, right, who um, depending on who you ask, either was or still is the head of the Office of the Special Counsel in the Justice Department, the agency that basically sort of protects federal whistleblowers. You
Hmm.
know, he's protected from being removed by statute. I suspect this court's going to have problems with that statute.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep.
right. So I think the reality is that I think there are cases Trump is clearly going to lose. I think there are cases he has a really good chance of winning. Um, But just flooding the system with all this noise, I think, probably tilts the odds a bit more in his favor in both
Totally.
categories,
Yep.
right? Than would have been true if we took them one at a time.
Um, what is then, and maybe the answer is a political answer and not a legal answer, but he obviously has to have some smart legal mind saying to him, look, there is both statute by Congress and the Constitution that says you cannot deny birthright citizenship, and yet he does it anyway. Is that just political because he knows it will be political popular, even if it is ultimately overturned?
I think
Or
that's
is
right. I
there a
mean,
legal is there some legal argument to be made there?
so I'll say I think the answer is no.
Okay.
Are there lawyers out there who have tried to retrofit legal justifications onto what he's doing? Yes.
Of
But,
course.
Chris, one of the consequences of a president who does not suffer the traditional political costs that other presidents suffer
Yep.
is that these kinds of calculations get totally skewed. So, Joe Biden, probably knew there was a good chance he would lose on student loans in the Supreme Court,
Yep.
but he thought it was worth doing because he wanted to at least look like he was fighting for the policy, right? Um, I don't think Donald Trump much cares if he loses. I mean, I think he cares a little, but he wants. I don't know that he wants the policy so much as he wants the visual that he's trying to do this.
I
Um,
agree.
right?
And
Look,
the delay will be
right.
such
That's right. It
that
helps him.
you can kind of muddle it. And like you said earlier, I always think he's always looking for a scapegoat, right?
Yep.
So it's kind of like I tried to do this, but the rhinos wouldn't let me. You know what I
Yep.
mean? Like he's not going to be like, oh man, yeah, it does say that in the Constitution. I was wrong. You know what I mean? Like he's not going to even if he loses, as you say, he will. It's not
Well,
gonna.
and I think
He's
the
not going to
best
say that.
I think the best example of this is what he's doing at Guantanamo. So
Okay.
he makes this big announcement that they're going to build out the so-called Migrant Operations Center at Guantanamo, which is not the military detention enemy combatant side, right? It's actually something we've had at Guantanamo since the Haitian refugee crisis in the 90s. He says we're going to expand it all the way up to 30,000 beds, right? It's utter nonsense. There's no way the government has the money or the logistical capacity to do that, right? How many people has he actually sent there? By all accounts, maybe 30,
Yeah.
um, right?
Not 30,000, Steve.
Not 30,000, right? And given that we are removing from this country like 400 to 500 non-citizens a day, right? Sending 30 randos to Guantanamo
I mean,
accomplishes nothing, right? And so, right, the point there is not that he's actually trying to accomplish his policy. The point is that he's trying to look like he did something as opposed to actually doing it.
absolutely. I always used to say in newsrooms, and this doesn't, newsrooms don't really exist anymore, and people don't really like go into them, even to the ones that they do exist. But I used to say it was editors would do management by walking around. They just kind of walk around, and be like, how things going? Good, good. But there was no like actual deliverable. It wasn't like they had a meeting and they were like, hey, Chris, we want you to do X, Y, and Z. It was just like, well, I mean, I walked around the newsroom. I can't be required. Like they just wanted to see activity. They didn't want to sit in their office and do nothing. It's sort of the same thing. It's like he just does a lot, and then it's kind of like yada yada yada. Oh, it got overturned. But for his base, I don't know that they really care, and I don't know that they really think that birthright citizenship, easy for me to say, is going to get overturned. It's more like, well, he's willing to take that fight on.
Yep. Yep. Right.
It's hilarious because
He's doing
I'm
what he
old enough to
promised.
go. Yeah, I'm old enough to remember the Jim DeMints of the world, the sort of the old timey conservatives who all had the pocket constitution and would bring it out,
Yep.
the little one that would fit in the suit pocket and bring it out, which is hilarious to me. Where now it's like, well, I mean, a constitution. It's like, dude, that was the whole thing that you. Anyway, okay, I have two more big things. One, legal system ready for this? Could it be ready for this sort of onslaught? Because I will tell you, he's doing obviously, and you know this, he's doing the same thing on the media end of things, which is just putting out story after story after he's saying things, saying this, saying that. Gulf of America, Canada 51st state, Greenland, the penny, we're gonna ban, and it's hard, I think, to cover all those things. And the media in our current iteration is not really capable of doing it. How does the legal system bear up under what is going to be, as you've said, is an onslaught?
So there's one respect in which the courts have a huge advantage over everybody else, which is perjury. um, right? And
Yep.
so,
Yep.
this was so true during the first Trump administration. There is such a radical difference sometimes between what the White House says in the press briefing room and what Justice Department lawyers say in open court.
So
Um,
true.
and Chris, we've seen that already. I mean, we've seen DOJ have to file two separate, like, really mea culpa apologies in two separate cases already for providing misrepresentations. Um,
Interesting.
right, including about like
So
the
what's being
yeah,
said publicly does not convey with what in a legal sense is being said.
that's right. And so so courts have that defense that members of the media don't. Right, and so
Yep.
what that means is that the government, I don't know that the government is fully honest in its filings in court, but it's certainly much more honest in filings in court. Um, that's one big shift because what that means is that instead of sort of drowning the system with propaganda, right?
Yep.
You've got trial judges who actually can focus on sworn affidavits, right? On testimony given under oath, and on representations made by DOJ lawyers who, Chris, frankly, are risking their own professional careers if they commit
Absolutely.
these right? So that's one. The second thing is that from a pure capacity standpoint, and this is going to be a little weird, but bear with me. Um, the chunk of cases that was basically sort of overwhelming the DC federal district court until a month ago were the January 6th criminal prosecutions.
Absolutely. Yes.
And one of the real, I think, unintended ironies of President Trump commuting some of those cases and pardoning the rest is that all of a sudden a whole bunch of federal judges in Washington had a lot
So
more time on
true.
their hands,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Now,
Calendars just opened up.
I mean, and so, not all of these cases are being filed in DC. I mean, we've seen some in, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Maryland, Seattle. I mean, that's going to be what the pattern. But, from a pure logistical capacity standpoint, the irony is that Trump himself helped to create it. Um, right. And I don't know that anyone ever thought through the A to the B there.
Unintended consequences. I want to do one more big subject, but first I want to plug Steve's Substack, which is One First. If you have not checked it out, I mean, again, like this, uh, all politics. I learned this during the 2000 election. All politics ends with the law and with lawyers, and I'm relearning it every day of the Trump administration. And there is no better guy, no better expert, no one who knows his stuff better than Steve. All right, so Steve, I'm going. I want to end, and,
Yeah.
and we don't need to end this second, but I want to end on the big subject that looms over everything, and you've mentioned it several times: the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have some subscribers. It's not none, and it's not everyone, but it's a chunk who say the Supreme Court is 6-3 into conservative liberal, and the idea that they will rein in Trump's worst impulses, whether it's birthright citizenship or going all the way to the extreme of repealing the 20, getting rid of the 22nd Amendment and basically allowing him to be president for as long as he wants,
Right.
is a fallacy. And they point to the immunity ruling as sort of the Pandora's box being open. Can you talk about the immunity ruling first, and then let's talk more broadly about sort of how you view this court, because it is, as you pointed out, with the legislative branch kind of ceding the playing field.
Yeah.
We really only have two of the three players on the field, and we know what Trump is going to do in the executive. So I feel like they're the free radical that we don't totally understand. So can you talk about how you understand the immunity? Were you surprised by it? And then let's broaden out and talk about the court.
So yes, I mean the first thing to say is I was really surprised by the immunity ruling, and actually I was surprised by almost everything about how the court handled that case. Um, I was surprised that they didn't hustle in December of 2023 when Jack Smith asked them to. I was surprised at sort of how they rewrote the question they were deciding. I was surprised when in the middle of the oral argument, Neil Gorsuch starts talking about how we have to write a rule for the ages. Um,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Um, I think the immunity case is a real problem. Ironically, less, Chris, because of its immediate consequences, and more because of just how much Article 2 power it endorses. Um,
Interesting. Okay.
I mean, right? We've been lucky enough in American history to only have one president who's been criminally prosecuted. Um, right? Trump. We can hope that Trump is going to remain a class of one in that space.
Yes. Right.
But every president's going to claim Article 2 powers, and the
And
John.
can you, Steve, for the non,
Yeah.
explain Article 2 just very quickly so everyone knows what we're talking about?
Yeah, sorry. This is I lapsed into law professor brain.
No, 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 it's fine.
So Article 2 is a shorthand, right, to Article 2 of the Constitution, which is the part of the Constitution that sets out the executive power. One of the really, I'll say, annoying but also complicating things about the Constitution is whereas Article 1 is very specific about Congress's powers, Article 2 is deliberately more vague about the president's. Um, and so just, one really nerdy semantic illustration. The very first provision of Article 1 says all legislative powers herein granted are vested in a Congress,
Yep.
right? Article 2 does not have the herein granted language. So right off the
Right.
bat, you have like, oh, there are powers not listed in Article 2.
Yep.
Most presidents, and certainly every modern president, save again, maybe Jimmy Carter, have claimed Article 2 powers, meaning, right, one of two things. One, the power to act unilaterally, so when Congress has not acted.
Yep.
And then two, Chris, even more aggressively, the power to act in the face of congressional restrictions, right? The power to override
Yep.
statutes Congress hasn't acted. And what is, sort of historically, the Supreme Court has been sort of all over the place in that first bucket about the unilateral powers the president has. It has been very skeptical of the second, right? It's
Which
been
is the ability to override the legislative branch.
right. I mean, George W. Bush famously loses the Guantanamo Military Commission's case in 2006 because the court says Congress didn't authorize what you're doing, right? As opposed to, could you do it notwithstanding what Congress said? So
And the immunity ruling then would seem to drastically widen Article 2 power.
that and especially that second bucket, Chris,
Yeah.
the Article
Yeah.
2 powers that Congress can't touch. And so the problem is that what the court has done is it has now enabled. So take impoundment again, right? The president's power to refuse the president's claimed power to refuse to spend money Congress has appropriated, right? So before the Trump immunity decision, there wouldn't have been a single Supreme Court case you could even plausibly cite for the proposition that the president has that power,
Yep.
right? Now you can make noise about the Trump immunity decision supporting some of it, right? The president's ability to control the executive branch. There are cases before the Trump immunity case that give the president broad power over the senior level folks and some of the mid level folks. You would never have thought it extended to employees.
Right.
There's language in the Trump case that says that you could use. So my concern about the immunity case, Chris, is less its immediate effect on Trump and more how it empowers the very kind of president being above the law type arguments that we're
Yep.
seeing more and
Yep.
more from this administration.
And if we've learned anything, it's that politics is a very copycat business. I mean, I
Yep.
always say that it's sort of like very few executives, with the exception of Jimmy Carter, are like, you know what? The president has too much. The executive branch has too much power. Let me cede some of this power. That is not usually something they do.
And I'll just say it, and I think this was a big, big, big mistake on President Biden's part. I mean, I think Biden had an opportunity to work with Congress in his first, 6 to 12 months in office to do more of that, and didn't. But bygones are bygones. With regard to sort of what this means for the Supreme Court going
Yes.
forward, so
How should we think about the court
yep.
vis-a-vis Trump?
So let me say two things, right? The first is it's important to remember that this court ruled against Trump a lot the first time around.
Mhm.
Yes, it upheld the third version of the travel ban, but it struck down the second. Trump lost the census citizenship case, which he really put a lot of effort into. He lost the case about trying to rescind DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood
Yep.
Arrivals immigration program. Chris, he lost the two subpoena cases in 2020.
Yep.
Uh, and the court had opportunities after the 2020 election to put at least some of its, prestige behind some of the challenges to the election. And Chris, it sat on its hands.
Totally. Did nothing.
did nothing.
Yep.
Which is not which like
Good thing.
I think was a good thing, right? Like
Right. Right.
responsibly sat on his hands, right? Turned away all of the emergency attempts to get the court to
Right.
step
I
in.
mean, I remember the one that what's his name in
Ken
Texas. The
Paxton.
Yes, Ken Paxton brought, and they didn't hear it. I mean, they basically were like, "This is." It was the this is my non-legal assessment. It was the this is beneath contempt answer.
I mean, basically. So, against that backdrop, right? This is a different court. I mean, we're now on the far side of not just, Justice Barrett's appointment, but also, the court that decided Dobbs and Bruin
Yep.
and,
Yep.
the major questions doctrine and, the Trump immunity case. So, yes, it's a different court, but I think this is a court that is still going to believe that it has some responsibility to be a bulwark. And just
Okay.
one really small data point. I mean, I think this has already been lost to history, but right before Trump's inauguration, he had tried to get the court to block his, ultimately sort of slap on the wrist sentencing,
I cite this all the time. Please, yes, go.
right? And in the New York hush money case, and
Yes.
he lost 5-4. Um, Now, there are folks on sort of in my orbit who can't believe there were 4 votes to let him get away with that,
Sure.
and I get that. But it's worth emphasizing there were 5 votes to not, and it was the 3 Democratic appointees. It was Chief Justice Roberts and it was Justice Amy Coney Barrett. And I think, Chris, any sort of big partisan tinged rule of law fight involving the Trump administration, that's going to be the lineup to look for. Is are Roberts and Barrett going to side with the Dems to sort of to stand up for our institutions?
And do you I have been criticized by some people who subscribe who say that I'm too Pollyannish about the threat that Donald Trump represents, that there aren't going to be elections in 2028. And if there are, he will find a way around the 22nd Amendment, that the Supreme Court is pliant. Am I being Pollyannish about it? I mean, you know the court better, certainly than me, and I would argue better than most of these people criticizing me. So, you know, is your I mean, this may be the exact same thing you just said, which is it three plus Coney Barrett and Roberts, but much do you think slash worry about that? Because I mean, obviously, if that happened, well, the Constitution now becomes something that's kind of like, well, yeah, when we agree with it, we'll do it,
Right.
but when we disagree, and which means it's not a founding document anymore. Like,
Right. There's, I
how
mean,
do
right.
you?
There's the old Andrew Lang quote about how economists use statistics, right? The way a drunk uses a lamppost, more for support than for illumination. Um, right? That's
I
how we're
love
using the
that.
Constitution.
I
That's how
love
we're using
it.
the
Right,
Constitution.
right.
So I guess I go back and forth. I am not, like, I'm not convinced, for example, that we're already in the middle of a full blown constitutional crisis.
Off the top. Yep.
But I also think that the guardrails keeping us from one are not there. Um, and so, I think we're
And just
closer
to
to
be
that.
clear, Steve,
Yeah.
is is the biggest guardrail not being there in your mind the legislative branch's absence?
Yes, and
Okay.
Chris, I mean, you're the political expert much more than I am, but the just countless examples of both direct and indirect leverage that having to deal with Congress necessarily imposes on the executive branch.
Oh
Um,
gosh. I mean, yeah, yes, it's
right?
gigantic. I mean, and again, just for people who are new-ish to this, just because one party controls the White House, the House, and the Senate has not traditionally been a guarantor that whatever the president wants, the president gets. I mean, I have told many uh, people over the years, you could talk to speakers of the House who would make the argument to you, maybe not publicly, but privately, that they were more powerful than the
Yep.
president of the United States.
Yep.
So this kind of this willing giving over, like basically just being like, hey, being a rubber stamp, we'll do whatever you say. Just because it's Republican, 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 or Democrat, Democrat, is not how it has always worked.
But now it is, right? And that's and
Yes.
so and so to sort of tie this back to your original question, that's visible, right, to all of us, including John Roberts, right? And so I think for as much as I've been critical of the Chief Justice's behavior last term in the Trump immunity case, in the Chevron case, et cetera, you know, here's a guy who is deeply invested in his own legacy and in
100%,
right
and always has been.
and
I mean,
always
I
has been.
remember 2005. He is a guy with an eye on how will I be remembered? How will the court I
Yep.
guided be remembered? Yes,
And especially because so much of what Trump is doing right now is not part of the long running conservative legal agenda, right? I mean, especially because this is not just getting to overruling Roe and
campaign
expanding the Second
finance.
Amendment and campaign
Yeah,
finance.
right.
No, but right. I mean, like I I mean, I've never been especially like I've worried about Roberts when it's been a fight between his institutionalism and the sort of long-term goals of the conservative legal movement, right? That's not what this is. This is a
No,
fight between the institutionalism and monarchical power in the United States. And my own view is that I think not in all of these cases, Chris, and probably not even in the cases where I think it should, but in more of these cases than Trump is going to want, I think this court's going to push back. And the question then is, does that, exercise the right um, sort of leveraging effect, right? Does that take
right.
some pressure out of the balloon, or does Trump dig in his heels and say, as Andrew Jackson actually never did, John Roberts has made his ruling, let's see him try to enforce it, right? Like that's the question that. So the place where I'd push back against the Pollyanna view is
Yes.
I'm not 100% confident. I'm not even 75% confident that when that happens, things will get better.
And I think that goes to what are they the Trump people trying to solve for? Are they trying to solve for, let's see if we can test the outer edges and then push all the way out, and then if we push slightly less far, we'll get something? Or are they saying, let's push the outer edges, and if we don't get what we want, we'll
Yep.
just ignore it, right? And those are two obviously very different.
They're very different, and it's possible, Chris, that there are senior people in the White House who ascribe to each of those views.
Yeah.
Right? To me, and I'm beating a dead horse at this point, but to me, the way that you create the conditions where the folks who say, all right, we should push the envelope but not burn it up, the way that you create the conditions where those folks can win is to make it clear that if they try to burn it up, um, there are 5 to 10 congressional Republicans in the House and the Senate who are going to start thwarting their entire agenda.
Yep.
And whether
And
that
we
means
haven't seen
not
that.
right, whether that means not confirming nominees, whether it means caucusing with the Dems, whether it means supporting impeachment resolutions, right? We're not there yet, but I do wonder if there's enough folks left who have at least enough of an institutional conscience that when we get to that point, they would step up.
I think that's so interesting because I think it's I don't think people, when they think of Trump's, how this is going to be played out in the courts, I don't think they even think of Congress, and yet they may wind up how they behave even more than the courts and even
Yep.
more than the executive branch. They may be the sort of scale that tips it one way or the other.
I mean, we have a historical example. So, there were discussions in the Nixon White House about whether Nixon could ignore the Supreme Court's ruling in
Yep.
July 1974 that ordered Nixon to turn over the Watergate tapes.
Yep.
And, the sort of the narrative that I think is now the consensus view is that Nixon was talked off that ledge by senior advisors who told him what little support he had left among Republicans in Congress
Yep.
would evaporate if he did that. And that he'd be guaranteeing not just his impeachment, which at that point seemed likely, but his removal, which at that point, at least until the tapes came out, was still at least somewhat up for grabs.
And I think that's so telling too, because I think it's really Donald Trump, how far Donald Trump will be able to overreach, will be, I think, how much it is constrained will be almost entirely determined by his party. Yes, I mean, of course, yes, Democrats will do things. I mean, to try to limit, but it is his party and who's, because Nixon, to your point, Nixon is ultimately undone by Republicans in Congress saying like, "Yeah, we're just not going to do this anymore." Like, I mean, like, this isn't going
Right.
to
So I
work.
mean, Goldwater, right? Goldwater, after the smoking gun tape comes out, right? Goldwater goes to him and says, my best guess is you have 7 votes in the Senate.
Yep. And I just anyway. Okay, I don't want to go too long, but I do. Here's what I do want. I want to say thank you to Steve, number one, because I always get smarter, and thank you for doing this. Number two, if you have not subscribed to Steve's Substack, it is called One First Steve Vladeck, Vladeck. Now, I love Steve when he was the distinguished professor of whatever law at the University of Texas. Okay, I loved him even then, even though my family are all Aggies. I love Steve even when he was at UT. But now that he is at my alma mater, which I believe is how Georgetown is referred to commonly, the Georgetown University of America.
It's on my
Uh,
business card. Cillizza's alma mater.
you must follow and support this man because he is doing work that is not only relevant now, but as we've talked about. I mean, look, I believe this is the central dynamic of the Trump presidency in terms of how much can he do and how much will he do. Steve, thank you for the time. Folks,
That's Chris.
if you joined us, thank you. There will be a copy, at least I know I will run this on So What on my Substack. Steve may do the same on his.
Yep. Yep.
If you can catch the whole conversation. And Steve, if you don't mind, I'm going to publicly try to get you to commit to do another one of these because I don't think this story is going away. And like I said, my whole goal with these is I am not an expert on a bunch of this stuff, and I love being able to talk to smart people who can be thoughtful, not predictably partisan, and informed, and make us all smarter. And you are one of those people. So thank you.
I'm happy to do it, Chris, and
Okay,
I appreciate that you're trying to make everybody smarter. I think that's what we
trying,
need.
man. It's a battle. We can win, Steve. All right, take care.
Thanks, Chris. Bye,
Be
everybody.
well.